the year dot to about the mid-90s, infrastructure was a public good. The public sector was the provider of infrastructure. They built it, they maintained it, they provided the services, and there was really no debate on this at all. Now there are some learnings from that experience which I'll get into in the course of my remarks. The second phase started in the mid-90s, and Rakesh Mohan is here. He was instrumental in sort of building up basically a strategic framework, a strategic and financial framework for the second phase, when the understanding that public infrastructure was simply not adequate to meet the needs of the system, and private investment had to be activated, to be incentivized. So what were the financial requirements, what were the regulatory requirements that would, and also the commercial sort of implications of private infrastructure were laid out, and the sector was opened up. But for a variety of reasons, again, which sort of lead into the learnings to the latest phase, this wasn't terribly successful. The one exception, of course, which we all cite endlessly, and are now getting somewhat frustrated with, of course, because things have changed somewhat, is telecom, which from late 90s or 1999 onwards, as a result of some refinement of the telecom policy, the licensing and the revenue sharing policy exploded. So connectivity improved dramatically. The quality of both basic services and the variety of services that were provided by telecom companies increased very rapidly. So by the early 2000s, in the sort of early years of our high growth phase, we had quantum jumps in telecom service availability and quality, and at very low prices. Pricing was extremely competitive. But other infrastructure really didn't show the same kind of responsiveness in terms of incentivizing private investment. The one success we had in that period, the National Highways Authority, the National Highway Development Program, which was basically coordinated by the National Highways Authority, was predominantly at that point from public investment. There were some private elements in it, but it was predominantly a public program. So in fact, what we were seeing then, and looking back over that period, was that perhaps infrastructure still would be successfully executed at large scales by the public sector, and you had to bring in other disciplining mechanisms to improve the efficiency and the quality and so on. But on a variety of other fronts, power and so on, we really had issues. Now, the third phase, perhaps starting the mid-2000s, was the PPP, the Public-Private Partnership model. And there the recognition was, all public has its problems, all private has its problems, let's try and find the hybrid. It worked in some respects. For example, in the power generation sector, in the 5 or 6 years of the PPP framework, we built enough capacity to meet all our requirements. And at this point, we have about twice the capacity we're actually using in terms of generation. But two factors sort of came in the way of this being effectively utilized. One was you generated it, but you couldn't distribute it for a variety of reasons. And two, you needed coal to fuel the generators, and you didn't get much growth in fact, you got no growth in coal production at all. As a result of which, from the sort of mid-2000s, we started to import steam coal or thermal coal. And that was one of the contributing factors to the sort of balance of payments problems that precipitated in the build-up to the taper tantrums and so on. So we had the generation, but we didn't have the distribution, we didn't have the coal. So it became an issue of alignment. Different sectors were simply not in alignment with each other. Now, all of these experiences, all of these episodes raise questions about what the right mix of inputs from different sectors is. And one of the, I think, most significant consequences of the PPP phase, Arvind referred to it in his remarks, was the spillover from private investment in infrastructure to the financial sector. In the early phase of this, or the early stages of this phase, private promoters of infrastructure projects were looking for money. Banks were really looking for borrowers. There wasn't too much credit activity in the conventional lending spaces. And the two found each other. There was obviously a push from government, look, this is important, this is priority, and banks should be lending. So we saw a very rapid build-up of bank lending to infrastructure projects, many of which, as we know, and if you look at the counts, 300, 400 large projects in stages of stagnation. They're stuck for various reasons, approvals, regulation, unclear policy, and so on. But all of this means that they become non-performing assets, non-performing loans, and defaults start to materialize, however much flexibility and so on you show. So by the end of last year, 2015, or in fact during the course of 2016, the banking sector as a whole had about 17% of its lending to infrastructure projects, but about 50% of its bad assets were from that sector. So you see the sort of the swing in bank lending towards infrastructure contributed to a significant escalation and compounding of the asset quality problem. So what is the learning from this experience? Well, basically that traditional modes of project financing from banks or lending, term lending, simply did not have the capacity to absorb the risk that our infrastructure projects were subject to. So their inability to absorb that risk basically meant that even if projects were starting to move forward, the ability to lend to them was constrained. So if they weren't in an administrative and regulatory logjam, they might find themselves in a financial logjam. So this wasn't really going to solve anything. So the latest stage of infrastructure development, and I think this has its origins in the budgetary announcement of 2015, in fact, it was an announcement that had been made somewhat earlier in a different context. We had something called the National Investment Fund announced in 2004, which really never took off. The idea there was to use it as a kind of, I would describe it as a venture capital private equity fund for infrastructure projects. And the initial budgetary allocation was 200 billion rupees, but the idea was to use that as a basis for raising money through a variety of sources to create this pool. And more so, I think more importantly, it was to, at the end of this process, having got the project to a point where revenue streams were relatively assured, and there's no infrastructure project in India that won't generate adequate revenue streams if the pricing is right, because it is a seller's market there. That if you could get the business model right, then the opportunity to privatize these would emerge. So that mechanism has been put in place. A governing council has been created. The finance minister chairs it. There are a number of people from the financial sector on it, as well as from the bureaucracy. CEO has been hired. He's apparently in the process of relocating from here. He was in the IFC, and we expect that somewhere. The model. So maybe he'll give us a little bit of his plans as he goes along. The model should be in place now. What does this do? I characterize it as a transition from the PPP, which basically expected inputs from both sectors, but on a somewhat simultaneous or synchronized basis, and which did not materialize. The financial and managerial capabilities of the private sector combined with the regulatory and administrative efficiencies in the public sector, and these things did not go together. And the outcome of that, as I've said, is essentially the risk profile of projects changed dramatically. The riskiness of projects between conception and commencement of business was very unlike a traditional bank lending framework, and the ability of banks to absorb those risks obviously simply did not exist. So what we're trying to do here then is to pass on this risk-bearing function back to government. And so I call it an FPTP, not first past the post, which is the more common expansion of FPTP, but first public, then private. And what it means essentially is that the public sector bears the early risk, the early stage risk of the project through this National Infrastructure Investment Fund. And then at some point, assuming the willingness is there, and we've had discussions on, when a public sector project has to be privatized, there are always challenges. But the model, I think, depends heavily on this. When revenue streams are relatively so visible, if private investment comes in, then that creates the space and the capacity for this mechanism to expand its reach to get into new projects. I think the finance minister referred to this process slightly differently. He called it asset recycling, but it is essentially the same process, and that's why I find the analogy of venture capital, private equity entirely appropriate. That essentially the learning from the very first phase of infrastructure development is that we got the infrastructure projects going. We had lots of infrastructure projects, but they were run pretty inefficiently. They sort of, their contribution, their productivity, their efficiency declined over time. And the mechanism to sort of keep these going, and of course there are many exceptions, I don't want to get into that, making a sort of sweeping statement, was perhaps a result of the incentive systems and the sort of organizational framework being somewhat weak. So if we can combine these two, which is the ultimate objective of PPP, that you combine the strengths of the public and the private, I think what we've moved from is the simultaneity of the process to sequentiality, and I think that has some promise. As I said, there are lots of pockets of success. I think the Delhi airport, despite certain questions about its sort of the contractual and financial dimensions, is a good example of a successful airport. I think it runs extremely well. Gets flooded once in a while, but that's a rare occurrence. I think the experience with power generation was very positive, because it really changed the nature of the relationship between the generator and the distributor. But the capacity of distributors to absorb that power was where the weakness materialized, and there is something that is addressing that in the form of the Uday program, and I won't even attempt to expand that. I can't remember the Ujjwal Discom.
Oh, I don't remember.
Well, it's a plan to improve the financial viability of the state distributors. So this is, I think, a relatively promising scenario for getting out of a somewhat weak groove with infrastructure. And to me, at least, it brings in the right combination of the public role and the private role. The main problem with the private role, as I said, is that it's simply been incapable of absorbing the early stage risk. And with that having been passed on to the public sector, I think the combination of the two might become viable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Subir. There's an old saying that to fix the macro, fix the micro. And I think you've just heard a brilliant exposition of that storyline here, because I think the problems in the banking sector that Arvind referred to are very much related to the way these infrastructure projects were financed and designed. The former Secretary for Transport, happens to be my brother, was once asked, how come your sector has created so much problems for the banking sector? And he turned around and said, well, actually, he thinks the banking sector created the problems for the road sector, because they over-financed all these projects and they didn't do proper due diligence and all that.
Under his pressure.
Under his pressure. So, thank you again, Subir, for explaining the intricacies of the macro and the micro. I think we should nominate Subir to be the executive director of the IMF and the World Bank together. Then you can solve this.
I've actually worked a whole day.
Anyway, let me now turn to Dr. Ratin Roy, the director of NIPFP, and we are so fortunate to have him. But also, this conference, as you of course have well aware, is a joint conference with IIED and NIPFB, and we hope this tradition will carry on in future. Next time, perhaps in New Delhi as well. But Ratin Roy, of course, has also had a very distinguished career before joining NIPFB. He was the director of the Asia Pacific Regional Center at UNDP in Bangkok. Before that, he was the director of the Policy Center for Inclusive Growth in Brazil. Most importantly, he has been the title is Special Economic Advisor to the 13th Finance Commission, which was a very important finance commission that he worked on in India and contributed to immensely. So Dr. Ratin Roy will speak on, he's also, by the way, it's not mentioned here, but I know that he's the member of the FRBM panel. This is the panel that has just been established to look at the revival of India's Fiscal Responsibility Act, and perhaps he will comment on those issues as well. Thank you, Ravi.
Okay, now Arvind spoke extensively on the macroeconomy, so I'm going to snapshot it for you guys in 2 weeks. One, to try and bring out what debates we are having on the macroeconomic way forward, and the other to summarize what the problem is. Now, this is not a slide for those of you who are students here that I had ever a privilege to see when I was a student. I never ever saw a slide where world output, emerging economy output, emerging market and developing economy growths, both in terms of estimates and projections, were significantly below those of my country. It was quite the opposite. And this has been the case now for some time, for 3 years. So, if you want to quibble about the growth rate, do so, but there's a lot of margin there. So, make no mistake, India is today the fastest growing.
Just to update, it's now 7.6.
7.6, yeah, I do. But before somebody says something is wrong with the numbers, I thought I'd stay with you once. That's becoming fashionable in India. So, we are growing. Okay? And we have been growing well for some time. This is very nice. We have actually had to worry about negative inflation on one index of inflation, wholesale price index, for some time now. And of course, as Arvind says, the global economy is not doing well, and therefore we are not doing well in terms of our merchandise trade. But notwithstanding that, we seem to be able to come up with 7.4% growth. If you look at components of GVA, we have better news coming consistently now from industry and manufacturing. It's not just services. And this year, with an uptick in agriculture, this should get even better and come to the top end of Arvind's estimates. The current account is well, I have two former EDs, former deputy governors here. Couldn't be better. Very benign situation. We're able to manage a steady depreciation in the exchange rate consistent with the value of the current account deficit, which allows people to actually think productively about hedging, or they ought to be. I cannot recall a single time in my life where I could have said all these things together. You know what? My mother-in-law is not happy. Bombay is not happy. Agriculture is not happy. Generally, people are not happy. So we have these numbers, and everyone from Delhi comes here and says, look, there are these numbers, we're doing great. But forget an international audience of suspicion, my mother-in-law is not happy. She's not normally happy, but this would make her rather happier than she has been in the past, but she's not happy because there is a sense that all this is not translating down into the lives of people. That would be fine, normally, because macroeconomics is not about the lives of people. But also, when Bombay is not happy and the agricultural sector is not happy, we have to worry about what's wrong. And I think that is the worrying that Arvind has been doing. So I thought about food, because this is what people talk about a lot. That it's okay, your inflation expectations are coming down on CPI, etc., but food prices have been high. That has been the case in the past, but as you see, other than pulses, which have been a problem, but Arvind has fixed it, I wish you had asked him about this. He fixed it yesterday. There's a report that he's brought in which will fix our pulses problem. Essentially, I think we'll import more. I don't see what else we can do. But other indicators, other food indicators, inflation has moderated quite considerably and is benign over the last year. Perhaps the trouble is that this is not, filtering down to my mother-in-law yet. But I hope it will. On the firm side, well, despite all the clamor for reductions in interest rates have reduced. And if you just sit back and look at how much they have reduced, this is not trivial. Forget yesterday's 0.25%, rate cut. This is a non-trivial reduction in interest rates over 2 years, and has been consistent with the maintenance of low inflation and the introduction of an institutional monetary policy framework which commits the central bank to keep inflation below 4% and to try as hard as CPI inflation and to try as hard as possible, below 6% and to try as hard as possible to bring it to 4%. And in that environment, we've executed a non-trivial decline in interest rates, which continues. But firms are not happy. Growth in merchandise trade, as I said, is low. There's not much we can do about that. On the other hand, what has happened in the net is that our current account deficit remains fairly low. Imports have collapsed, as Arvind was saying, somewhat faster than exports, and that means that, at least from the point of view of the macroeconomy, we are okay. So, there are this is true, and so what happened was that 2 weeks ago, we met with all the rating agencies in connection with our FRBM work. We met Moody's, we met Standard & Poor's. I said, look guys, I know that, our per capita income matters a lot in how you rate us. But, positive to stable to positive, maybe get rid of a minus, shouldn't we be on track to do that? Their answer was not that our model is sticky, but they said there are two things wrong with you. One I can do nothing about. They said there's something wrong with the structure of India. So the big takeaway was, and this is important for students to remember, it's not enough to deliver a good macroeconomy when you're in a position where you have to listen to rating agencies and you're dependent on them. It is not enough. Because then we will move into normatives. That is my big, I knew this would happen, but that is a big lesson we took. What is wrong with our structure? What you read in the newspapers. The recognition that there is something inherently weak about the structure of governance and policy making in India, which is not being fixed, and therefore some discomfort that going ahead, these indicators may not be sufficient to deliver consistently at least the kind of growth we are getting, and that our vulnerability to both internal and external shocks because of the poor quality of the structure is high. What is interesting to me is that this is encapsulated for them in the one area which I have not spoken of here, which still continues to worry, which I'll move to in a second, which is the conduct of fiscal policy in India across time. And there, I think the rating agencies worry correctly when they come and see New Delhi, and I think they worry without looking at one important positive dimension which I disagree with Arvind on, because they don't leave Delhi and Bombay. And that is what I'm going to say in the second part of my talk. So, the structure business. I mean, since the government changed, there's been no shortage of ongoing, consistent reforms in a variety of areas. I'm just listing them here. Very important, as Arvind mentioned, the bankruptcy code, adoption of the inflation targeting framework, the Constitutional Monetary Policy Committee. Broadly, the understanding is, on the monetary policy side, we now have our institutional schedules in place. And the conduct of monetary policy henceforth, with the MPC appointed, etc., will be on the lines you would expect of a modern G20 economy. On the fiscal, I'll talk about in a minute, but I want to highlight one very important change that's happened in terms of fiscal operations. From next year, we have abolished the planned non-planned distinction, which means that we will not be looking at how the government spends money according to something called a 5-year plan and something else. But we will be doing two things. We will be moving, and we'll be the second last country in the G20 to do this, the last being the US, which will never do it, to a medium-term fiscal framework. And saying this makes me feel very happy, because I had given up the idea that I'd never see this, till my dying day. But quite rapidly, the decision was taken over the last 18 months, and those of you who read what I write know that I go on like my grandmother went on at me to eat my vegetables in the government every 2 months, do this, stop this, nonsensical system of budgetary policy making. So the entire budgetary policy-making framework is changing. Right from the date of presenting the budget, I don't know why this was not done, which is going to be advanced to February 1, which means that the old situation where we presented a budget and the budget was not passed on the last day of the financial year will no longer obtain. We have in place now a public financial management system which at least provides real-time information on budget execution. The central government and states are joining it on a voluntary basis. We will be moving into consistent 3-year medium-term budgeting in a real way, which is that budget submissions that come after the call circular will require budget holders to provide 3-year frameworks, and if they have not spent their money on X, they will not get money for Y. They will be asked to justify why they didn't spend it. So these are sort of boring reforms for most people, but very interesting ones for me. So in terms of improving state capacity, I think on the fiscal and public management side, we have the central government finally moving into a medium-term framework. So this medium-term framework will replace essentially the plan-non-plan distinction. And if all goes well, we should have all this in place to be operationalized by fiscal year 18-19. So that's the big fiscal reform that has happened in the past perfect sense. It's very important for students of India to remember in India, we have to be very careful with the present continuous tense. Is happening is not a credible statement in India. Has happened is good. So this is has happened. It's past perfect. Can't believe I'm saying this. More. Merging of the railway budget to the union budget. And one reform which for some reason people don't pay enough attention to, because I think there's skepticism about this, but it's actually going ahead. And it means confronting vested interests. The corporate tax rate in India is 30%, headline. The effective rate of tax paid by most companies is about 24%. This is most domestic companies. And the bigger you are, if you're more than $10 billion, you pay less than that even. So most companies, Indian companies, are not paying the headline rate. The only people really paying the headline rate are some foreign companies. So this reform announced last year, and we're moving into phase 2 in this budget. I'm quite confident we should get it down to 28, at least this budget. Basically works by cutting exemptions. Other than 2 exemptions, the depreciation and the minimum alternate tax, which are operational exemptions. What were these exemptions? These exemptions were essentially stuff we gave people because our governance was crap. So we said, okay, we have crap governance in India. So here, if you're coming to the power sector, here's a tax break. Or we have crap governance for R&D. Oh, you want to do R&D? Here's a tax break. So we were basically buying out, in my view, people who wanted to come to India but wouldn't come by giving them tax breaks. So now that the thesis is that governance is improving, the idea is to dispense with all these tax breaks and get companies to pay around 25%. And the research we have done in IPFP shows a classic Laffer effect. We will get more taxes with lower tax rates. And as far as I can see, the government is very serious about this reform. And this reform affects, if you know who works in the power sector, and you know what kind of people invest in R&D or don't, then you will realize that this does take on some very important, entrenched, powerful lobbies in the country. So this is a great reform. And finally, 2 more things. I don't know why this went unnoticed. Oil prices, as you know, follow a random walk. And my interpretation of this has been great. So that's a policy price. Meaning the oil price is what I choose for it to be. So we have effectively chosen in India to keep oil prices at $70 a barrel. And essentially whatever the price is, we tax it up to 70. When oil prices fell, it was very tempting for government to pass this on politically, any government. The government did not. And that has also been responsible for our ability to recover fiscally from other shocks we had. This, for me, is a signal that this government is not afraid to take political, risks. And is not populist in any way. Again, food subsidies or food price subsidies, price subsidies on food have actually been cut by cutting them and by better targeting. And finally, every government spending program is going to be accompanied by a sunset clause, which means that, including the employment guarantee program, which means that you have to give a date when you will justify why this program should continue. And as a good social democrat, I think it's a reasonable question to ask. When NREGA was introduced in the heyday of our growth, I said, why are you introducing an unemployment program when we are growing? People are supposed to get jobs. So the problem is, we grow and people don't get jobs, hence we need this NREGA. But then we must correct that, and therefore the clause. Similarly, there are clauses about public provisioning of services in health, education, a variety of areas. This should spark a conversation on where we are going in terms of what the state will provide and what will not, which is very clear. Okay, and the final slide on reforms, all the good things that I tell people who want to invest in India. The first one is quite bizarre, I used to be on this commission. Because we are paying our civil service more, we'll be able to see growth in demand. And when you pay your civil service more, your growth rate goes up. So this is real win-win. Invest in your civil service, pay them more. When they spend the money on cards, and you can, and growth goes up because public administration is a delta. Passage of GST to reduce cascading effect on taxes. You will notice I've been very particular in highlighting one good thing about GST. The rest I will hold my judgment. I will say no more. The monsoon's been good. There's been a pickup in rural demand, as Arvind said, rising foreign direct investment, and now slowly an uptick in corporate earnings. So you can actually see sort of startup beginning to taxi happening in India by virtue of all these reforms. All right. Now we come to the big elephant in the room, the thing that gets Mr. Thume really mad, and I have a lot of sympathy for him. I think in India, we go through many existential crises. And one existential crisis we're going through now is what Arvind will address, I'm told, in his economic survey, which is the role of the state. What is the state to do, and what is the state not to do? This came home to me very forcefully in the FRBM committee, when we said, okay, now we have to judge FRBM for 15 years. And I said, well, should we have a discussion on the size of the state? Because that's the first thing if you're financing something. So currently, and I put this to you as a question, all of you who work on India should think about it. General government, which is the center plus the states, we tax, to pay for general government, we tax 17% of GDP, and we borrow 8% of GDP from the people of India. Because India does not borrow abroad to finance its domestic public debt in substantial measure. Now, the simple question I've been asking, and I'm asking you, is this too large? Is this too small? Is this just enough? Somewhere, somebody has to take a political economy view and address this question. Why? Because if I'm told that my health spending is 1/3 the global average, my spending on public health, and I must increase it from 1.4 to 3 or 4, my counter question as a fiscal guy is, so you want me to increase the size of the state to 28? Or you want me to keep it at 25 and stop buying aircraft carriers? What do you want to do? I need to know. Because otherwise if you tell me we must raise tax GDP ratios to spend more on health, development economists love telling me this. My answer is, if you're happy with 25% of the state, no, we will not do that. We will not do that. We will then reduce debt. So it's an important question. I'm not taking a view on how large the state should be, but it's a very important question. And it has gone since Mr. Nehru completely unaddressed. Which is why Mr. Thume gets bad, because the expectation was that this government had a view, an ideological view on the size of the state. There is no evidence whatsoever that this government is any such view. So all state investments are okay, and the same sort of fuzzy logic with respect to questions like how do I increase my spending on health or education continues. So this is a very, very important thing. This is also important because government is, or at least half of it is sick, and seriously sick. The revenue deficit, for those who don't know, is basically an imperfect measure, but not that imperfect, maybe 0.5% of GDP imperfect, of how much the government borrows for consumption expenditure. And by consumption expenditure, I do not mean anything normative as a development economist will understand it. I know that teachers produce students who contribute throughout their lives to the benefit of India by raising human capital. But my submission to you is, would you, if I said that to Professor Stephen Smith, and I said you have now contributed 30 students who are going to contribute to global human capital instead of globalist, I would have sacked you in June because you've done your job. Then my expenditure on Professor Stephen Smith would be capital expenditure. But the fact that I need his services year after year because of an old rule in economics, Euler, exhaustion, means that I have to pay them year after year, means that those things on which government must spend year after year must be classified as consumption spending. It's not a bad thing, but it is important that if you're going to spend something year after year, that you finance it not through borrowing year after year. You must tax, and this takes you back then to the size of the state. It's not just a composition issue. The central government has not succeeded in doing this for the last 36 years. It's very interesting long-term trend in India. So that number is called the revenue deficit. Now if you look at the revenue deficit and how it's grown as a proportion of the fiscal deficit, of which it is a subset. So fiscal deficit is total borrowing, revenue is what you borrow to consume. So borrowing to consume as a percentage of the total has gone from 4% in 1980 to 19% in 1991 to I think 57% in 2001 to 72% last year. And now it is 68. It's reversed from time to time. This to me is a secular trend. It's a long-term secular trend. What I can tell you about this trend, and I'm only talking about central government here, is that the two biggest, the traditional answer in India is subsidies are bad cut. If I cut subsidies by half, I will still borrow to consume. Okay, so it's not subsidies. Number one, and it's not government employees. Number one, it's interest on debt, so it's legacy of legacy. Number two, it is now increase in central government spending. But here's what I learned in the Pay Commission. 88% of central government employees are not civil servants. 88%. They either work for the Indian Railways, or they're providing postal services, or they wear uniforms. Second fact, the size of the paramilitary in India, since this is an international affairs school, strategic studies, has grown from 400,000 personnel in 1990-91 to 1.4 million personnel now. The only department of government whose budget has gone up by 36% in real terms in the last 15 years is the Ministry of Home Affairs. So now for me to be a fiscal purist, and I'm thinking aloud here, and say we must cut this red line to zero becomes pragmatically difficult to argue. Unless you tell me something about the Indian political settlement that I want to hear, but the Home Ministry does not tell me.
Blue line.
But yeah, blue line, sorry. Yeah, the center. Green line. So that's my difficulty. So basically what you have now is a center that is providing law and order services, and thanks to a great hire we have made, hopefully will also do its other job, which is providing merchant banking services to the nation. We will leverage capital for investment. But the idea that the central government, and I've seen a nice disagreement with me and Arvind, is the prime mover in terms of public investment is not true, has not been true for many years, and will not be true in my lifetime. You want public investment, it's not going to come from the center. So that's that one. So I have this major problem in terms of what the central government is going to do instrumentally in terms of the macroeconomy in the next few years, given this compositional mix. And that is the bad news. And that's very bad news. Now, with the states, the picture, as you can see, is totally different. You'll see in the previous slide, the red line, the states do not typically borrow to consume. And that fact has been true now, this is brilliant, for 10 years. And this is very exciting. And this is where I disagree with Arvind. And I think we have an attitude problem in the country. Because this is true of rich states, it's true of Bihar, it's true of Madhya Pradesh, it's true of Gujarat. It has nothing to do with how poor a state is, or how rich a state is, or where a state is located, which is not how most discourses in states go in India. You know, states in North India are bad, states in South India are good, states in South India are bad. But this is not true here. Bihar runs one of the most well-regulated sort of fiscal policy regimes in India. The three defaulters are the three traditional defaulters of this: Punjab, Kerala, and West Bengal. One's a rich state, one's a high human development state. There's nothing you can find in common, and this is good. Finally, so this is what they're doing, and in the current FRBM, they're allowed to borrow for investment up to 3%, and they're doing that. They were in fact very parsimonious with it. As you can see, they were not coming up to 3% for quite a while. Look at that red line; they've just about come there now. But that is wonderful. So Bihar runs now a current surplus of 1%. And it runs a fiscal deficit under the rules of 3%, which means it is able to invest 4% of its gross state domestic product in Bihar, if there was something to invest in Bihar. That is not true of the center. And this raises interesting questions, because this means that when we talk about public investment, driving private investment, etc., the scene of action is no longer New Delhi. But But people don't leave New Delhi. People come to Delhi, they fly to Bombay, nice airports, nobody goes to Bhubaneswar, nobody goes and sees that here are, I keep telling private business this, if you want to make money, go to Bihar. There's leverage money there for you. You have to talk to them a little more. There are no people like me sitting there and, talking your language, so you have to learn to talk to them. But there's action there. And this is the good news in terms of fiscal policy. I just want to point out very quickly, this is FRBM work, I think it's all public information. There is a myth in India that all central government love to, if you go to that British building, North Block, they will tell you these things. Oh, this all happens because the centre bails out the states and bankrupt. And we've done lots of empirical research. There is no evidence that states have faced bailouts. And one proof is here. Below the line is good things. Forget that big one, that's an outlier. Below the line, because of a change in accounting, below the line is when states did good things towards fiscal consolidation. And above the line is when bad things happen. You will find that the mix, this is sigma states, all states, is about, states have done stuff on revenue, states have cut expenditure, states have used all the instruments at their disposal to come to this happy situation where they are in sound fiscal health, by and large. And it is not true, finally, just look at the light blue, that central transfers to the states. So that's the normal argument given, oh, the centre has been transferring money to the states. It is not true that central transfers to the states have been the prime or the major driver in improving state health. The dark blue, which is states' own revenue effort, cutting revenue expenditure, and in bad times, putting a check on capital expenditure, have all contributed to making the states much more solvent now than they were 10 years ago. So the practice of macroeconomics now has to move to understand this fiscal reality, because in the macroeconomics, if you're saying that the binding constraint is the fisc, then that's an incomplete picture. The binding constraint is the fisc, but there is an entity here which is far better equipped to take the sort of imaginative steps you want the public sector to take than the sector. But the prior question before that is, what do you want the state to do, and therefore transitively, how do you want it to grow, and where do you want it to grow, and in which areas do you want to see it grow? You can see with the central government, our hands are relatively tied, but these questions can and should be asked at the state level. It's a big country, so sigma states is a legitimate macroeconomic variable that ought to be usable. And I think it is in that direction that we will have to take our move on fiscal policy. So to conclude, we have a problem with, we are told now by everybody from my mother-in-law to Moody's, that while you're doing well on the macroeconomic front in terms of monetary policy and management of the current account, there's a problem with your governance, and there's a problem with the conduct of fiscal policy. Then I'm told that the bad fiscal policy is a reflection of poor state capacity and bad governance. I'm also told by people like Arvind that governance in the states is worse than in the center because they're dynastic. I'm surprised. I thought the Congress party is a dynastic party and ran us for most of my lifetime. Very dynastic. That being the case, I think there's a half-truth here. Because while fiscal policy is in trouble, it is in trouble in New Delhi. It is not in trouble at the state level. And in fact, therefore, I think that our focus on improvements in both governance and in public service delivery, etc., should use this springboard that we have with the states to move forward rather than being focused as much as we have been on what used to be the imperial capital. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ratin and Subir. I noticed, of course, that Subir, you were also the chief economist for S&P and also for CRISIL, which are a rating agency. So, not to put you on a spot, but if you want to talk about, if you want to give your opinion on the latest interchange between credit agencies and the government of India, you're welcome to do so, but I don't mean that you need necessarily go there, if you wish to. And to Ratin, I think you laid out the fiscal issue very well, but there is one aspect that I think where everybody expected Modi ji to be much more aggressive on getting India out of public sector enterprises. And so we do have a balance sheet issue that we have about $500 billion worth of assets sitting in public enterprises. And whether you increase the size of government from 25 to 30 or what, that's a deeper question. There is an issue here of being able to change the balance sheet of the government by selling some of these and using that money through that NIFF, since the new head of NIFF is here, into expenditure on infrastructure and other issues. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in case you wish to address any of these issues, but you don't have to, and if you want to, you may wish to, but otherwise I'll open it up for some Q&A for the next 15 minutes. Anybody? Yeah, Puna?
So very good
Some mic,
presentation,
please.
Sudhir and Ratin. Now, so there is a question which has two parts. So Ratin, you showed us that currently the size of government is 25%, and perhaps it's just the right size for our level of income. So at the same time, you showed the composition of that expenditure, and it seems to me it's very hard to reduce any of that. These seem sticky expenditure, whether it's wages, health, education. At the same time, there is need, and to which everybody agrees on infrastructure spending. So how will that come about within this 25%, which we may agree is okay with? Second is, how did East Asian countries, what kind of size of government did they have? And if you're aspiring to go down that road of growth and development. And a related question is, so if there is need for more infrastructure financing, where is that going to come about? I mean, ultimately, the entire linchpin of financial sector in India is the banking sector. Everybody is claiming to get some amount from there, whether it's private sector, whether it's infrastructure companies, whether it's deficit financing of the government. And I know that there is risk aversion in India on borrowing abroad. But international financing conditions have been really good for a longish time, and that cycle may turn around. I mean, should we be a little bit less risk averse and give the banking sector space and not require it to fulfill so many different financing requirements?
We'll take two more questions. That's it.
Ratin, actually making me understand something about the intricacies of fiscal policy. I appreciate your presentation. And I have a small question for you, which you started initially talking about microeconomic and the sizes of states and the diversity that we have in India. One question for you is then, if there is this level of diversity in sizes and in fiscal budgets and so on and so forth in every state, why is there an insistence on the part of the center to have a replicable policy across states? Why don't you just throw it at the states and say, do your best and we trust you and we'll let you do what is good for you? I mean, is that even a possibility when you're talking about fiscal policies like this? Because it keeps coming up in other sectors in similar issues.
Take one more question,
Thanks.
Sadanand. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a quick question. I'm Sadanand Dhume with the American Enterprise Institute of the Wall Street Journal. Quick question for both Ratin and Sudhir. First for Ratin, I'm actually a lot less bleak than a year ago, and I think your broad position that this government has embarked upon a certain set of reforms, I think is widely accepted. But I am going to push back on one statement you made, which is that you believe that this is a government that's willing to take political risks. Now, when you put up that slide of the reforms that the government has actually done, I think most people looking back at, say, 2014 or in the run-up to the 2014, I don't think it was as much a question of, size of government as percentage of GDP, even though I agree with that characterization. But it was more like, will this government actually do things that have been on the reform agenda for a long time, and we felt that were not done because of political circumstances. Ajay spoke about privatization. There was also talk of being much more assertive on labor There was a talk of undoing some of the problems with the land bill from the previous government and so on. And it's hard to reconcile what has happened with political courage, given that there was an ongoing debate about these reform measures that frankly have not come to pass. So that's sort of the first. And for Subir, I was really sort of taken by this idea of FPTP. And I'm wondering how that squares with something Arvind raised in his presentation, which is, the rise of the CVC and the CBI and these kind of organizations. Because on the face of it, at least for a layperson, FPTP seems to be saying that, the public sector is going to take the risks and then we're going to then pass it on to the private sector. And I imagine that in this particular environment, that could be even more of a political time bomb. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
So let's come back to who would like to go first. Sudhir?
The question on ratings, I think what we need to recognize is that there is as Ratin, they use the term normative, but essentially a judgment dimension to a rating and a sort of model-driven dimension to it. And you may sort of question or challenge the model that rating agencies use, but you have to also appreciate the fact that they use it consistently across countries, across sovereigns. The weight given to fiscal, both the current situation and the projections is high in a rating. Ultimately, it is a rating. It's not a rating of the economy, although many people interpret it as being that. It is a rating of the ability of a particular entity to meet an obligation. And so the weight of both the current fiscal situation, the historical trend in debt, and the projections of these things play a heavy role. So when you look at India in comparison to its cohort, which is the lowest level of the investment grade, it stands out on many fronts. It's very positive on many fronts, many variables that reflect the larger macroeconomic situation. But it looks, in terms of the fiscal parameters, looks rather weak. So these weights tend to offset each other a bit. Where the judgment comes in is more in terms of the outlook, which is, where is this headed? And to the extent that you've seen a transition from negative outlook to a stable outlook, I don't know, one of them has moved to positive. Moody's has moved to positive. That would suggest that they are responding to the developments that some of which Ratin and Arvind were talking about. I think overall the transition from spec grade to investment grade is very critical, and for India it certainly showed. If you remember the time in 2007 when all three actually reached over a period of 6 or 8 months, took India from spec grade to investment grade. We had a capital inflow which was a deluge. That's when our whole exchange rate regime also had to be changed. So in a sense, the autonomy being given to states to spend money is becoming better, is increasing, but the efficiencies of centralized tax collection are being exploited. So I think this is a trend that actually does combine the two benefits of efficiency in the fiscal arrangement and autonomy or decentralization in terms of the right to spend money. But of course that has to come then with more capacity, wherever that capacity is. And then in that sense, I think differentiation across states, whether it is regional or any other dimension, there are capacity differences. These are quite visible in outcomes. And I think somewhere some focus needs to be paid on how do you, if you're giving more money and more autonomy to states, how do you simultaneously also increase their capacity to spend it wisely? There is a political accountability issue, but there's also just an administrative bureaucratic kind of issue as well. I think Sadanand's question about the risks, it's a transition in regime. Valuations are very important. And one of the problems we've had, this is a tangible question, a tangible problem, that when government assets are privatized, everybody raises question of value. And all that we've seen in terms of Colgate and Spectrum are essentially those. That's the root cause, which is you don't trust the value or the mechanism by which the transfer is made. I've written on this, but my basic argument is that you need a politically buffered framework to do this, to sign off on valuation, and that means not having it subject to the control of a particular party. So when you're talking about very long-term assets and very long-term valuations, an infrastructure project 30, 35, 40 years, then I think you need a parliamentary committee kind of a framework which has representation from all sides. That has its own gridlock problems, but we've seen with parliamentary committees that when they have a mission and a mandate, they do function relatively efficiently, and I think they add an enormous amount of legitimacy to any decision. So my sort of configuration of the NIIF was that you have the mechanics of it, the sort of the calculations and the financial aspect, but the governance aspect has to then reflect political engagement in the valuation process. So it's not then a person who signs off on the sale is not vulnerable to an accusation that side payments were made or underselling took place or whatever it is.
Thank you, Sudhir. Ratin?
Yeah, let me just address Poonam's question first and comment on something Sudhir said in context of Jyotsna's question and come to Sadanand's question. It's very important. He's taken very seriously in India, and because he's right of center, people get all the more mad when he criticizes the government. So it's very important to listen to him. Poonam, my comments are basically on public borrowing. So the deal ought to be, in my view, that we should leave the private sector. Look, it's like this first. Total savings in India allegedly is 30%. And I know physical savings are residual. But if I take that number credibly, and I know that the government only borrows from financial savings, then I know that the private sector does have access to the rest. Now, what they're doing with it is another matter. To the macroeconomic level, that is there. It also means that if all these innovations Arvind and company have put into place, financial inclusion, etc. happens, I expect to see an increase in financial savings. So on that count, there is no need for government to borrow abroad, simply because, for public debt, simply because the adverse risks of doing so in the past, plus the policy view, and I'm young enough, and unfortunately so are our ministers, to remember 1991 and the IMF program very well, the policy decision that under no circumstances in my lifetime will India go into a program with the IMF if we can help it, requires us at the very minimum not to borrow abroad. That is one, and that's a clear red line. Having said that, therefore, it is inevitable that we will have to attract foreign investment, direct and portfolio, to finance private sector investment. So there, I think the government, by opening up FDI, is trying very hard. So that's a sort of, if you like, institutional contract. Government borrows at home, and will continue to do so for the next 2 generations, and the private sector, and the non-government sources go abroad to borrow. And then we hope like hell that this fiscal constraint is relaxed by an increase in the ratio of financial savings to total savings. But that we don't understand well enough. The other questions Sadanand asked, on fiscal variance, again, it is interesting that I would not say automatically that poorer states in India or states in a certain region are worse managed than richer states. There is a lot of atrophy that happens and recovery that happens in state capacity. I'll give you 2 examples. My own state, our state, Maharashtra. Maharashtra used to be a fiscally well-governed state. Today it is going in the direction of West Bengal. It has collapsed. Everything has collapsed. They can't manage their fisc. We have invested 5 years of capital expenditure in irrigation, and there is not 1 acre of increase in net sown area irrigated. Humongous corruption, collapse of basic operations at the district level, etc. In Bihar, you saw rapid recovery happening in the quality of public service delivery. So I think that these things are not parametric. They require state-by-state attention, and it is possible, therefore, to improve state capacity by addressing the peculiar problem well. Regrettably, I don't think that is the case with central government.